Let's speak to Sherwin, who joins us from our bureau in New York. Sherwin, lots of moving parts on this very story this evening. We'll start with explosions that have been heard in Doha. This amid reports of Iran launching missiles towards U.S. air bases in Qatar. What else do we know?
Well, it does answer the question, Bongiwe, as to whether the Iranians were or are going to respond to the United States strikes against its 3 nuclear facilities over the weekend. Of course, the Iranians have for a long time prefaced that any attack on their facilities or on the homeland would be met with a response targeting U.S. bases in the Middle East. And what we can confirm now is that there are reports of explosions across the capital of Qatar, Doha, where the United States has its largest military installation in the Middle East, an air base that is southwest of Qatar that houses some 10,000 U.S. troops, the AL-UDEID air base in southwestern Qatar. And so we are now at war, essentially, and this has been confirmed by the Iranian response here. We understand that the White House also confirming that they are aware of these strikes. And of course, before Qatar, just moments ago, before the strikes, about an hour ago, closed its airspace. And that sort of gave us pointers and indicators as to where we might be heading here. And then soon after that, we also got an alert from the United States and the United Kingdom urging their citizens in Qatar to shelter in place. So in terms of the choreography, there were indications that this was coming. We can now confirm that some ballistic missiles have been launched against U.S. military interests in the Middle East. We only have confirmation of missiles sent to the AL-UDEID air base in northwestern Doha. And of course, this is the largest military base in the region housing U.S. troops. Let me remind you what President Donald Trump also said, Bongiwe, ahead of these strikes. After the United States hit the nuclear facilities at Fordo, at Isfahan, and the third one, the president went to social media and said that any retaliation by Iran against the United States of America will be met with force far greater than what was witnessed when the United States struck those 3 nuclear facilities. So it seems now that we are going to have a back and forth here. If the United States is going to be true to its word, or true to the word of the president here, one can expect a forceful response from the United States.
And especially because, Sherwin, this is a U.S. president who just last week we were hearing about a 2-week deadline, then boom, 48 hours later, we then see quite a serious escalation. And all of this, Sherwin, is happening against the backdrop of a Security Council that is now also considering a new draft resolution that would call for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire in Iran and supporting a diplomatic pathway to address concerns around Iran's nuclear program. What more do we know about this draft and when it could come up for a vote?
Well, it made news yesterday, Sunday, during this emergency session, amid a push here for a diplomatic off-ramp, for a return to negotiations, despite the U.S. escalation targeting those nuclear sites. The Russians, the Pakistanis, and the Chinese, a joint introduction of a short draft resolution that would essentially call for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. It would endorse a diplomatic roadmap here in terms of addressing parties' concerns around Iran's nuclear program. Let me correct that. Not a nuclear weapons program, it's nuclear program. And concern in the main, Bongiwe, around some 400 kilograms of enriched uranium that the Iranians possess above the 60% threshold, which makes the trajectory then to the 90% required for an atomic bomb quite easy in terms of the time it would take to enrich 60% to 90%. So there is concern, right, from the International Atomic Energy Agency as to what that enriched uranium would be used for, because the argument is that it cannot be used. You do not require that level of enrichment for civilian purposes. So this resolution would address both the diplomatic path here, but also a call for a cessation of hostilities immediately. The question now becomes, will the United States veto or not? And I think history teaches us that when it comes to issues of Israel, the United States has just been targeted by the Iranians. in a retaliatory strike here. So you're seeing escalation despite this diplomatic effort. And I'm going to say for now, the escalation is going to win over diplomacy because history teaches us that.
And indeed, Sherwin, especially because this is an Iran that we saw over the weekend, was saying that it's going to respond decisively and seriously, not backing down. And as you say, this is not likely to end anytime soon.
No, it's not. And where we go from here remains to be seen. Who is going to be the peacemaker? Who is going to be the Mandela of the moment, right? A figure that can get people around a negotiating table. What we have learned is that even though, the Security Council might want to, uphold its mandate here of the maintenance of international peace and security, sometimes even resolutions, binding or not, are ignored by member states of these United Nations. And so the concern here now becomes, the choreography about how the United States will respond. As you well know, that despite, these strikes against these nuclear facilities, the United States has positioned military assets, including a U.S. strike force in the region, aircraft carriers, missile submarines, frigates, and destroyers, refueling aircraft. So they are capacitated here to respond. The question is, how long can Iran go, right? They have had a lot of their military infrastructure decimated. The supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, is in a bunker. So what sort of political capacity, what sort of military capacity do the Iranians possess, given how the Israelis over the last week have decimated a lot of that infrastructure? How long can the Iranians go here? And I'm not talking about the Iranian people. I'm talking about the Iranian government and its ballistic missile infrastructure that in large part has already been decimated. So we will be sitting on the edge of our seats watching this as you will, Bongawe.
And as we are on edge, showing also learning tonight that sirens are activated at American bases. At the same time, one thinks about the impact that this could have, especially on travelers that would want to stop over. In Qatar, now the airspace is closed. A lot of mayhem simply going to be caused there.
Well, if you're planning on a holiday to the Middle East, my recommendation would be to suspend or cancel that trip. Let me tell you what Donald Trump just a short time ago posted on Truth Social. Everyone, keep oil prices down. I'm watching. You're playing right into the hands of the enemy. And of course, a lot of discussion about how the Iranians would respond. Yes, we now see military strikes on U.S. interests in the Middle East, in the region. But there's been a lot of concern about the Iranians blocking the Strait of Hormuz, that essentially is a transit point for about 20% of the world's oil transfers. And so if they act in that regard, you are already seeing a spike in oil prices. So the localized implications of what happens next has global implications based on the fact that a lot of cars run on petrol and petrol needs oil. And so you do the math. This is going to affect people all over the world, including at the tip of Africa, in South Africa. If this continues to escalate, the markets have been on edge. Even Donald Trump is tweeting about the fact that oil prices are going on up here, and he doesn't want the oil-producing nations to fuel that rise. But it's not necessarily within the purview of the president to control the price of oil, given the escalation militarily you're seeing in that region. So, yeah, all bets are off, but cancel your trip if you're heading to Qatar today.
And indeed, Sherwin, and also this is a Trump who is, even on his social media account, is flirting with regime change. And these are two words that have been bandied about since we actually saw this particular escalation.
Yeah, it's a bit like him saying we're going to give them 2 weeks and then, striking within 2 days. And so one has to be very wary of the rhetoric and the diversions associated with that. The president now talking in one breath, soon after the strikes, that now he wants peace, that Iran should now negotiate and return to the negotiating table. And of course, then in the same breath, posting this on social media on Sunday, it's not politically correct to use the term regime change, but if the current Iranian regime is unable to make Iran great again, why wouldn't there be a regime change? And then the abbreviation MIGA, make Iran great again. So it was put to the White House press secretary in an interview on Fox News earlier today, Bonge, where Karen Levitt And this was her response: if the Iranian regime refuses to come to a peaceful diplomatic solution, which the president is still interested and engaging in, why shouldn't the Iranian people take away the power of this incredibly violent regime that has been suppressing them for decades? She added, so our posture has not changed. Our military posture has not changed. It was a question put to Danny Danon, the Israeli ambassador here at the United Nations yesterday, ahead of that Security Council emergency meeting. He was asked if the Israelis are seeking regime change. His response was, regime change is for the Iranian people to decide, not for us. This was echoed by the U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth yesterday at a press conference. This mission was not and has not been about regime change. That's what they're saying on the record. The question is, does the continuation of these strikes affect regime change on the ground? And that's a question I don't have the answer to.
And Sherwin, when you look at the story and how fast it's been developing, I mean, we also saw that meeting between the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, as well as, of course, the Iranian delegation. And when you listen to what the President of Russia had to say, is that the US's unjustified, as he calls it, unjustified attack on Iran's nuclear sites pushes the world towards great danger. And he also said something quite interesting, that he's going to try and see how to help the Iranian people, although very little on the detail there.
Yeah, and I mean, we can surmise about what that help might look like, right? It was the Iranians that have been supplying drones to Russia in its war against Ukraine. So what sort of capacity does Russia, that has been engaged in a +3-year military offensive against Ukraine? They've lost thousands of soldiers on both sides, infrastructure decimated on both sides. What capacity does a Russian Federation today have in support of an Iranian government fighting the largest and most powerful military in the world? Some questions around what China can do here, right? China is not engaged in a war, has not been engaged as the Russians have been. And so one imagines that in terms of what President Vladimir Putin can do here is very limited, given the strains on the Russian state based on the war they are already engaged in. The question is, what sort of supportive role can China play here, either militarily or diplomatically? These are some of the geopolitical concerns and questions we continue to have. But in terms of Russia supporting Iran militarily here against the United States, seems like a bit of a stretch, but, you know, who knows?
And Sherwin, at the same time, when you think about the assessment of the damage on the ground, yesterday it was anybody's guess, because you had the U.S. president speaking about extensive damage and others talking about how much of a weaker position Iran could be right now. But then you listen to Iranian officials coming out to say that actually no significant damage was actually caused on the ground. And for them, nobody should panic, even going as far as saying that Iranian people must trust credible sources.
Yeah, and that's called the fog of war, right? The rhetoric, shaping the narrative, owning the narrative. The Iranians will say, well, they didn't really damage our stockpiles of uranium. You're talking about monumental destruction in terms of the rhetoric out of the White House. And so who to believe here, right? What we do know is that those facilities were pounded by very destructive U.S. bombs, what they call bunker buster bombs, essentially penetrating below the earth before exploding. And a number of those ammunitions were delivered by those B-2 bombers that flew for some 30 hours to drop those bombs on those nuclear sites. The question is, the IAEA has made the case. Rafael Grossi, the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, said to the Council and said to the Iranians, we need access to these sites so that we can really understand what the lay of the land is. Is there radiation or not? The early indications are that there has been no contamination outside of those sites. The question, but it cannot be affirmed 100%. And so the IAEA inspectors who are in Iran already, they need access to these sites to really determine what the damage is and really understand what the Iranians retain in terms of the 400 kilograms of enriched uranium above the 60% threshold, and how to curtail the use of that uranium stockpile. These are all very complicated issues. There's a lot of distrust between the Iranians and the IAEA based on that report that came just before the Israeli attacks some 10 days ago. So, yeah, who's going to be the man that brings these parties around the table so that we can find a pathway forward here? Too many obstacles in the way right now.
Indeed, Sherwin, and if they will be willing to even come to that table to discuss what a possible ceasefire looks like, it's anybody's guess. But thank you so much, Sherwin, for that update. The SABC News correspondent, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, as we remind you, explosions have been heard in Doha there. This is Iran armed forces say that they targeted a U.S. base there in Qatar with what they're calling devastating and powerful missile attacks.